A waitress stood in Manhattan's finest restaurant while a millionaire screamed insults. Every diner waited for her to break. Instead, she spoke 7 words that turned his triumph into the most humiliating moment of his life. Grace Mitchell had learned that some mistakes echo louder than others when the Bordeaux, a $400 bottle that Richard Blackstone had specifically requested, missed his wine glass by half an inch and splashed across the white tablecloth instead. The restaurant, La Maison, went silent. 43 diners in Manhattan's most exclusive French establishment stopped mid-conversation, forks frozen halfway to mouths, as the dark red wine spread across expensive Italian linen like blood from a wound. Grace's hands didn't shake. Not yet. That would come later, in the staff bathroom where no one could see. Right now, she simply said what every server learned to say when the impossible happened. "I'm so terribly sorry, sir. Let me get that cleaned up immediately." Richard Blackstone, 6'2", designer suit that cost more than Grace made in 3 months, hedge fund CEO whose face regularly appeared in the Wall Street Journal, stared at the wine stain with an expression that made Grace's stomach drop. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Like he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of excuse. "You're sorry," he repeated slowly, loud enough that the silence in La Maison grew heavier. 43 people listening now, pretending they weren't. "A $400 bottle of wine that I ordered specifically from your limited reserve, and you're sorry." Grace had been working at La Maison for 8 months, long enough to know the difference between customers who got upset over genuine mistakes and customers who saw service workers as targets for whatever frustrations they carried from their powerful lives into exclusive restaurants. Richard Blackstone, she'd learned over his dozen visits, was very much the latter. "I'll bring another bottle immediately," Grace said, her voice steady despite the electricity of attention from every table. "No charge, of course. And we'll have the tablecloth changed." "Do you have any idea?" Blackstone interrupted, his voice rising now. "How much money I spend in this restaurant? How many business dinners I've hosted here? How many clients I've brought to this establishment?" Catherine Morrison, Blackstone's date for the evening, blonde, elegant, watching the scene with an expression Grace couldn't quite read, reached across the table. "Richard, it's fine. It was an accident." "It's not fine," Blackstone snapped, not looking at Catherine, his eyes fixed on Grace with the kind of intensity that made her feel like a specimen being examined. "I come to La Maison because I expect excellence, perfection, not some clumsy waitress who can't perform the basic function of pouring wine without destroying a $400 bottle and ruining my evening." Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came when wealthy men who'd never struggled a day in their lives decided that their convenience mattered more than someone else's dignity. She'd felt it 3 years ago, standing in a hospital corridor, watching administrators explain to David Chen that his 5-year-old daughter Sophia couldn't receive the urgent medical procedure she needed because his insurance wouldn't cover it and he couldn't pay up front. She'd felt it when the medical board had stripped her license for performing that surgery anyway, in a hospital corridor, with whatever supplies she could grab, because a child's life mattered more than protocols designed to protect institutions rather than patients. She felt it now, standing in front of Richard Blackstone, who thought $400 gave him the right to humiliate someone for being human. "Sir," Grace began carefully, "I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Blackstone's voice crescendoed, and Grace saw diners at nearby tables exchanging uncomfortable glances. Thomas Rossi, La Maison's owner, was emerging from the kitchen, alerted by the commotion. "I'm not upset. I'm appalled, disgusted, that someone who clearly lacks the competence to work in an establishment of this caliber is somehow employed here." He turned in his chair, addressing the room now, playing to an audience that hadn't asked to watch this performance. "This is what we get for being generous, for giving opportunities to people who clearly aren't qualified, who can't even pour wine without making a mess." Grace's fingernails dug into her palms. 3 years ago, she'd had steady hands that could operate on hearts the size of plums, that could suture vessels so small they were barely visible without magnification. Hands that administrators said had violated protocols by saving a child's life without proper authorization. Those same hands had poured thousands of glasses of wine in the 8 months since she'd lost everything. Tonight, for just one moment, they'd missed by half an inch. And Richard Blackstone thought that gave him the right to strip away her dignity in front of 43 witnesses. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Grace said, and her voice was still steady, still professional, still everything Thomas Rossi had taught her about maintaining composure when customers forgot that service workers were human beings. I'll have this corrected immediately. You know what your problem is? Blackstone leaned back in his chair, warming to his theme now, clearly enjoying the attention. Several diners had their phones out, Grace noticed distantly. Recording. The modern version of the Roman Colosseum, except the lions wore designer suits. People like you don't understand excellence, don't understand what it takes to succeed. You pour wine, badly I might add, and probably go home thinking you've accomplished something. Meanwhile, people like me build empires, create value, actually contribute to society. Catherine Morrison's hand covered her mouth. Not shock, something else. Grace saw her reaching into her purse, pulling out her own phone. Richard, Catherine said quietly. That's enough. It's not enough, Blackstone continued, ignoring her completely. Because this is the problem with America today. We've created a culture where incompetence is rewarded, where people who can't even perform basic tasks think they deserve respect, deserve opportunities they haven't earned. This waitress, he gestured dismissively at Grace, is a perfect example. Probably thinks she's entitled to $15 an hour for spilling expensive wine and ruining people's evenings. Thomas Rossi was approaching the table now, his expression tight with controlled anger, but Grace held up one hand, stopping him, because she'd spent 3 years being silent. 3 years letting people reduce her to a mistake she'd made by saving a child's life. 3 years working jobs she was overqualified for, hiding who she'd been, accepting that the world had decided her value based on the worst moment of her professional life rather than the best. And Richard Blackstone, with his hedge fund, and his designer suits, and his absolute certainty that wealth made him superior, had just reminded Grace exactly why she'd thrown away her career in the first place. Mr. Blackstone, Grace said, and her voice cut through his tirade like a scalpel through tissue. Clear, precise, carrying to every corner of the restaurant that had gone absolutely silent. You're absolutely right about one thing. Blackstone stopped, surprised that she was speaking. Diners leaned forward. I did spill your wine, and I apologize for that. It was clumsy and unprofessional, and you have every right to be disappointed. Grace paused, meeting his eyes directly. But I need you to understand something. When you leave this restaurant tonight, you'll forget this moment. You'll go home to your penthouse, sleep in your expensive bed, wake up tomorrow still being Richard Blackstone. Successful, wealthy, important. She gestured at the wine-stained tablecloth. This $400 bottle of wine that I spilled, I'll be paying for it out of my wages. It represents 3 weeks of my income. 3 weeks of choosing between paying rent or buying groceries. 3 weeks of wondering if I can afford the subway fare to get to work. The restaurant was absolutely still. Grace was aware of phones recording, of Thomas Rossi frozen halfway to the table, of Catherine Morrison watching her with an intensity that felt different from the other diners' morbid curiosity. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Blackstone, Grace continued, and her voice was gentler now, almost pitying. I'm not intimidated by your wealth. I'm not impressed by your success. Because I've learned something you'll probably never understand. She picked up the wine-stained tablecloth, held it up so everyone could see. This stain? This is just cloth. Just money. Just a mistake that can be fixed with soap and water and 3 weeks of my labor. She set it down carefully. But the way you just spoke to me, the way you tried to strip away my dignity in front of all these people, that's not about wine or competence or excellence. Grace leaned forward slightly, and her next words were quiet, but carried clearly in the absolute silence. That's about a man so insecure in his own worth that he needs to crush other people to feel big. And that, Mr. Blackstone, is something all your money will never be enough to fix. The silence that followed was so complete that Grace could hear her own heartbeat. 43 people frozen. Thomas Rossi staring. Catherine Morrison's phone still recording, but her hand trembling slightly. Richard Blackstone's face had gone from red to white. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. You can't speak to me like that. You're a waitress. I'm a person, Grace interrupted softly. Just like you. Just like everyone in this restaurant. And the sooner you understand that your bank account doesn't make you more human than someone who serves your wine, The sooner you might actually become the man you think you already are. She turned to Thomas Rossi, who was watching her with an expression that held shock and pride and something like awe. Thomas, I apologize for the disruption. I'll pay for the wine out of my wages. And if you need to terminate my employment for speaking to a customer this way, I understand completely. Thomas cleared his throat. Grace. But before he could continue, a man at a table near the window stood up. Asian, mid-40s, wearing a cardigan that suggested academic rather than business wealth. He was staring at Grace with an expression of absolute shock. Dr. Mitchell, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace Mitchell? Is that you? Grace froze. She hadn't been called doctor in 3 years. Hadn't been Grace Mitchell, MD, since the medical board had stripped her license. Her eyes went to the man, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. David Chen, the father whose daughter she'd saved, the reason she'd lost everything. I'm sorry, Grace said automatically, muscle memory from 8 months of being a waitress rather than a surgeon. I think you have me confused with someone. No, David said, walking toward her table, his voice growing stronger and louder. No, I know exactly who you are. You're the surgeon who saved my daughter's life. Sophia, 3 years ago, when the hospital refused to treat her because we couldn't pay up front, when they were going to let my 5-year-old die because we didn't have enough money. The restaurant's attention shifted entirely from Blackstone to Grace. Catherine Morrison's phone tracked to David Chen, capturing every word. You performed emergency surgery in a hospital corridor, David continued, and Grace saw tears in his eyes. With whatever supplies you could grab. No anesthesiologist, no surgical team. Just you and your hands and your courage. And you saved her life. My daughter, Sophia, she's 8 years old now. She's healthy and brilliant and alive because of you. He turned to face the restaurant, addressing everyone. This woman, this waitress that Mr. Blackstone just humiliated, lost her medical license for saving my daughter. Lost her career, her reputation, everything, because she chose a child's life over hospital protocols. David turned back to Grace, and his voice broke. I've spent 3 years trying to find you, to thank you, to tell you that Sophia asks about the brave doctor who saved her. And here you are, being treated like, he gestured at the wine-stained tablecloth, like you're worthless because you spilled some wine. The silence was different now, heavier, charged with a kind of electricity that had nothing to do with scandal, and everything to do with 43 people realizing they'd just witnessed something that transcended a millionaire yelling at a waitress. Richard Blackstone sat frozen in his chair, his face ashen, understanding that the narrative he'd controlled for the past 10 minutes had just shifted into something he couldn't dominate with volume or wealth. Catherine Morrison lowered her phone slowly, staring at Grace with an expression that suggested she was mentally recalculating everything she'd just witnessed. And Grace Mitchell stood in the center of La Maison, surrounded by expensive tables and recorded phones, and a past she'd tried to leave behind, realizing that sometimes the hardest thing about hiding is that eventually, someone always remembers who you used to be. The video went viral before Grace Mitchell's shift ended. Catherine Morrison, investigative journalist for the New York Times, though Grace didn't know that yet, had uploaded the footage to Twitter within minutes of David Chen's revelation. By the time Grace finished apologizing to the remaining diners and helping Maria Santos clean up the wine-stained tablecloth, the clip had been viewed 80,000 times and was climbing exponentially. Former surgeon who lost license, saving child's life. Now humiliated by millionaire for spilling wine, read the caption. Catherine had a gift for headlines that made people stop scrolling. Grace didn't know any of this yet. She was in the staff bathroom, finally allowing her hands to shake, pressing her palms against the cool marble sink and trying to remember how to breathe. 3 years. She'd managed to stay invisible for 3 years, building a quiet life where nobody knew Dr. Grace Mitchell had once been one of the most promising pediatric surgeons at Mount Sinai Hospital. And now David Chen had recognized her in front of 43 people with their phones out. Grace? Maria's voice came through the bathroom door, gentle and worried. Maria Santos, 55, had been working at La Maison for 20 years and had taken Grace under her wing from her first day. Thomas wants to see you in his office. Grace stared at her reflection, 35 years old, eyes that had seen too much. hair pulled back in the severe bun that La Maison required. The uniform that cost $200, which she'd paid for in installments over 3 months, now felt like a costume she'd been wearing in a play that had just ended abruptly. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had known that Manhattan was too small, that someone would recognize her, that you couldn't hide forever when your fall from grace had made the medical journals and ethics board's case files. She just hoped for more time. Thomas Rossi's office was on the 2nd floor, above the restaurant's main dining room. He sat behind a desk that had belonged to his father, the original owner of La Maison, surrounded by photographs of 50 years of service to Manhattan's elite. Thomas himself was 62, a man who'd started as a dishwasher and worked his way up to owner, who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated because of where you started rather than where you were going. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His voice wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. Grace sat, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the termination she knew was coming. You didn't speak to customers the way she'd spoken to Richard Blackstone. Didn't humiliate millionaires in front of their dates and 43 witnesses. Didn't bring personal drama into establishments that prided themselves on discretion and excellence. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas asked. The question caught Grace off guard. "Tell you what? That you were a doctor? That you lost your license saving a child's life? That you were—" He gestured at his computer screen, where Grace could see the video playing on mute. "Working here because you'd sacrificed everything to do what was right." "Would it have mattered?" Grace asked quietly. "I needed a job. You needed a waitress. Who I was before doesn't change that I'm qualified to pour wine and take orders." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that had seen a lot of people try to hide who they really were. The video has 300,000 views. Catherine Morrison, the woman who was with Blackstone, she's a Times journalist. Very good one, apparently. She's already called me twice asking for an interview with you. Grace's stomach dropped. "I'm not giving interviews." "I didn't think you would," Thomas said. "But you should know that the story isn't going away. People are already digging into what happened 3 years ago. The medical board case, the hospital's refusal to treat the Chen girl, your license revocation." He paused. "By tomorrow morning, everyone's going to know who you are." "Then I should probably start looking for a new job," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Somewhere that doesn't need their waitresses to be anonymous." "You're not fired," Thomas said. "In fact, you're getting a raise. And I'm posting a statement on La Maison's social media supporting you and making it clear that any customer who treats my staff the way Blackstone treated you tonight won't be welcome back." Grace stared at him. "You're banning Richard Blackstone? He spends tens of thousands of dollars here every year." "He spent tens of thousands of dollars," Thomas corrected. "Past tense. And I don't care if he spent millions. Nobody humiliates my people and gets to come back for dessert." He opened a folder on his desk, pulled out several papers. "I've been getting calls all evening from the other diners who were here tonight. Want to know if you're all right, if they can help somehow. 3 of them have offered to cover the cost of the wine Blackstone's refusing to pay for." "He's refusing?" Grace asked, though she wasn't surprised. "He left without paying his entire bill," Thomas said. "Catherine Morrison covered it, then tipped $500 with a note, apologizing for her date's behavior." He slid one of the papers across the desk. "This is from Dr. David Chen. He wants to meet with you. Says his daughter Sophia has been asking about you for 3 years. Grace's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "I can't. It's too. I made my peace with what happened, with losing everything. I can't go back to that life." "Nobody's asking you to go back," Thomas said gently. "But maybe you could move forward. The medical board's case against you was always controversial. A lot of doctors thought you were railroaded." "This video, what you said tonight to Blackstone, people are going to start asking questions about why a surgeon who saved a child's life lost her license, while administrators who refused treatment kept their jobs. The administrators followed protocol," Grace said, repeating the words that had been used to justify everything 3 years ago. "I violated it. Clear-cut case." "Was it?" Thomas asked. "Or was it a case of a system that values procedures over people? Because from where I'm sitting, you saved a little girl's life and got punished for it, while the people who were willing to let her die walked away clean." Grace stood up, needing to move, needing to not think about 5-year-old Sophia Chen's face, when Grace had first seen her in that hospital corridor. Blue lips, shallow breathing. Parents sobbing because insurance wouldn't cover the emergency procedure and they didn't have $30,000 in their bank account. Grace had grabbed supplies, had told the Chens to hold their daughter still, had performed a procedure she'd done 100 times in surgical theaters with anesthesiologists and nurses and proper equipment, except this time it was in a hallway with parents crying and security guards yelling and her hands moving with the kind of desperate precision that comes from knowing a child will die if you hesitate. Sophia had lived. Grace had been reported. The medical board had stripped her license 6 months later. "I need to get back to work," Grace said. "My shift isn't over." "Your shift ended when that video hit 1 million views," Thomas said, and Grace's head snapped up. "It's at 900,000 now. Should cross 1 million in the next hour. You're not going back on the floor tonight, Grace. Not with reporters probably waiting outside and every customer wanting to either hug you or take a selfie with the heroic doctor." "I'm not heroic," Grace said. "I'm a waitress who lost her temper and spoke disrespectfully to a customer." "You're a woman who reminded a room full of wealthy people that money doesn't make you better than someone else," Thomas corrected. "And judging by the responses I'm seeing online, a lot of people needed to hear that message." His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked up at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Catherine Morrison just posted a follow-up article. She's been investigating Richard Blackstone. Apparently tonight wasn't an isolated incident. She has documented cases of him verbally abusing service workers at multiple establishments, hotels, restaurants, retail stores, dozens of incidents over the past 5 years. Why would she investigate that?" Grace asked. "Because she's a good journalist," Thomas said, "and because watching him humiliate you apparently reminded her of other times she'd seen him treat people badly. She's calling for his hedge fund's board to investigate his behavior. Says that someone who treats service workers with such contempt can't be trusted to treat clients or employees with respect either." Grace sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. "This is getting out of control. I just wanted to serve wine and go home and not think about the fact that I used to save children's lives, and now I pour drinks for people who treat me like I'm invisible." "You were never invisible," Thomas said quietly. "I've watched you for 8 months, Grace. Seen how you treat the other staff, how you remember regulars' preferences, how you never make other people feel small even when they're making you feel that way. I knew you were special. Just didn't know you were saved a child's life against hospital protocol special." He stood up, walked around his desk. "Go home. Take tomorrow off. Let the internet do whatever the internet does, and then we'll figure out what comes next." "What if I don't want anything to come next?" Grace asked. "What if I just want to keep being a waitress?" "Then you keep being a waitress," Thomas said. "But something tells me the world isn't going to let you hide anymore. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." Grace left La Maison through the back entrance, avoiding the 3 reporters who'd already gathered out front. Maria had lent her a coat and scarf to cover her uniform, and Grace pulled them tight against the October cold as she walked toward the subway station. Her phone, which she'd left in her locker during her shift, had 47 missed calls and hundreds of text messages, most from numbers she didn't recognize. But 3 were from a name that made her stop walking entirely. Jennifer Barrett, chair of the medical board that had revoked Grace's license 3 years ago. Grace stood on the corner of Lexington and 68th Street, watching yellow cabs stream past, trying to decide if she had the courage to listen to those voicemails. 3 years ago, Jennifer Barrett had looked Grace in the eye and said, "You violated protocols that exist to protect patients. We cannot allow emotions to override procedures, no matter how well-intentioned." Grace had asked what procedures existed to protect patients whose insurance wouldn't cover life-saving treatment. Jennifer hadn't had an answer. Now Jennifer Barrett was calling her. 3 times. Grace pressed play on the first voicemail. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Barrett. I've just seen the video from La Maison tonight. I need to speak with you urgently about your case. Please call me back as soon as possible." The second voicemail. "Grace, it's Jennifer again. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm asking you to call. There are things about your case that you don't know. Things I couldn't tell you 3 years ago. Please." The third voicemail was different. Jennifer's voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I was wrong, Grace. About a lot of things. But especially about you. I'm watching you tell that millionaire that his money can't fix his insecurity. And I'm realizing that 3 years ago, I was more concerned with protecting the medical establishment than protecting someone who actually understood what it means to be a doctor. Call me, even if it's just to tell me what you really think of me. You've earned that right. Grace lowered her phone, staring at the subway entrance. Below ground, she could disappear into the anonymous crowds of Manhattan, could go back to her small apartment in Queens and pretend that tonight hadn't happened, that David Chen hadn't recognized her, that a million people hadn't watched her tell Richard Blackstone that human dignity mattered more than wealth. Or she could call Jennifer Barrett back, could find out what things she didn't know meant, could maybe, possibly, start asking questions about why saving a child's life had cost her everything, while the administrators who'd prioritized money over medicine had faced no consequences. Grace thought about Sophia Chen. 8 years old now, David had said. Healthy and brilliant and alive. She thought about all the children she'd helped during her 4 years as an attending surgeon. The ones she'd saved. The ones she'd comforted when saving wasn't possible. The ones whose parents had looked at her like she was a miracle worker because she'd treated their child like a person who mattered rather than a procedure to be billed. She thought about the last 3 years. Serving wine to people who didn't see her. Hiding who she'd been, accepting that her life's work was over because she'd chosen a child's survival over a hospital's protocols. And she thought about what she'd said to Richard Blackstone, about how his money couldn't fix what was broken inside him, about how human worth wasn't measured in bank accounts. Grace pulled out her phone and called Jennifer Barrett back. The call connected on the first ring. "Grace," Jennifer said, and her voice held something that might have been relief or guilt or hope. "Thank you for calling back. I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," Grace said honestly. "Give me one reason why I should listen to anything you have to say." "Because," Jennifer said, "the hospital administrator who refused to authorize Sophia Chen's surgery, the one who told David Chen that his daughter would have to wait for insurance approval, even though she was in critical condition. He was fired 6 months after your hearing. Turns out he'd been taking kickbacks from insurance companies to delay expensive procedures." Grace's breath caught. "What?" "It gets worse," Jennifer continued. "There were 18 other cases like Sophia's. Children who died or nearly died because this administrator delayed treatment for financial reasons. The hospital covered it up, paid settlements, made NDAs. But I found out, and I've been trying to figure out how to fix what we did to you without being able to prove what I knew." "Why couldn't you prove it?" Grace demanded, anger rising hot and sharp. "Because the evidence was sealed under those NDAs. Because the hospital's lawyers are very good. Because the medical establishment protects itself." Jennifer paused. "But now there's a video of you with 1 million views, and a Times journalist asking questions. And suddenly the hospital's very interested in making things right before this becomes a bigger scandal than they can contain." Grace leaned against a building, her legs suddenly unsteady. "You're saying I lost my license to cover up a bigger crime. I'm saying you lost your license because you did the right thing in a system that punishes people for caring more about lives than liability," Jennifer said. "And I'm saying that if you're willing to fight, I think we can get it back." Somewhere above Manhattan, a plane's lights blinked across the October sky. Grace watched it, thinking about trajectories and destinations, and the fact that 3 years ago she'd thought her life's path had ended in a hospital corridor. "Tell me what I need to do," Grace said. And Jennifer Barrett, who 3 years ago had been the face of a system that valued protocol over patience, began explaining how to dismantle the very system she'd once represented. The meeting happened 3 days after the video crossed 5 million views. Grace stood outside the small cafe in Brooklyn, where David Chen had asked to meet, watching through the window as a little girl with dark hair pulled into pigtails drew pictures at a corner table. 8 years old, alive, healthy. Everything Grace had risked her career to protect. Sophia Chen didn't know that the woman approaching her table was the reason she'd celebrated her 6th, 7th, and 8th birthdays. Didn't know that Grace's hands, now steady again after 3 days of shaking, had once moved with desperate precision to save her life, while hospital security screamed and administrators threatened legal action. "Dr. Mitchell," David Chen stood as Grace entered, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "Thank you for coming. Sophia, this is the friend Daddy told you about." Sophia looked up from her drawing, a crayon picture of a girl with a cape flying over a hospital, and smiled with the unself-conscious joy of someone too young to understand complicated things like medical licenses and protocol violations. "You're the doctor who saved me," Sophia said simply. "Daddy showed me the video. You told that mean man that being rich doesn't make you better than other people." Grace sat down carefully, overwhelmed by the matter-of-fact way this 8-year-old had just summarized both the worst and best moments of Grace's life. "Your dad told you about the surgery?" "He tells me every year on my birthday," Sophia said, "that I almost died, and a brave doctor fixed me even though she wasn't supposed to. Daddy says you're a hero." "I'm not a hero," Grace said automatically. "I just did what any doctor should do." "But the other doctors didn't," Sophia pointed out with 8-year-old logic. "They said Daddy didn't have enough money, so I had to wait. And if I waited, I would have died. So you didn't wait. That makes you a hero." David wiped his eyes. "She's been practicing that speech for 3 years, just in case we ever found you." "I looked for you," David continued, after Sophia recovered. "Wanted to thank you. But you'd left Mount Sinai. Your phone number was disconnected. It was like you'd disappeared." He pulled out his phone, showed Grace the screen. "Then I saw you on Twitter. 5 million people have watched you tell Richard Blackstone that human dignity matters more than wealth. Do you know what that means to people like me? Like us?" Grace shook her head, not trusting her voice. "It means someone finally said what we've all been thinking," David said. "That the system is broken. That money shouldn't determine who gets to live and who gets to die. That doctors like you who actually care about patients are punished, while administrators who care about profit keep their jobs." He leaned forward. "Catherine Morrison called me yesterday. The Times journalist. She's been investigating everything. The hospital administrator who refused Sophia's surgery? Turns out he denied treatment to 18 other children over 2 years. 3 of them died waiting for insurance approval. Their families got settlement money and NDAs. The hospital covered it all up." Grace felt sick. 3 children died? 3 that Catherine's found so far, David said. She thinks there might be more. And now she's digging into Richard Blackstone too. Apparently your video reminded her of times she'd seen him berate service workers, hotel staff, restaurant servers, even a parking attendant who scratched his car. She's documented over 40 incidents in the past 5 years. "Why would someone with that much money spend so much time being cruel?" Grace asked. "Because cruelty is how some people prove they have power," David said. "And Blackstone's about to learn that power has consequences. Catherine found irregularities in his hedge fund. Client money moved to offshore accounts. Returns that don't match market performance. She's turned everything over to the SEC. Sophia was coloring again, humming softly, unaware that the adults at her table were discussing the collapse of a millionaire's empire. Grace watched her, this child who should have died, who lived because Grace had chosen conscience over career, and felt something shift inside her chest. "Jennifer Barrett wants me to petition the medical board," Grace said quietly, "to review my case. She says with the hospital administrator's corruption exposed, there's grounds to reinstate my license." "Will you do it?" David asked. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "For 3 years, I've told myself that I made peace with losing everything, that being a waitress was enough, that I didn't need to be Dr. Mitchell anymore." "But you are Dr. Mitchell," Sophia said, looking up from her drawing. "Daddy says titles don't make you who you are. Your actions do, and your actions saved my life. So you're a doctor, even if you don't have the license anymore." Grace stared at this 8-year-old philosopher who'd just articulated what Grace had spent 3 years trying to deny. "You're pretty smart, Sophia." "I know," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "Daddy says I'm smart because my brain got enough oxygen when I was little. Because you made sure my heart kept pumping blood." She pushed her drawing across the table. "I made this for you." The crayon picture showed a stick figure with a cape flying over a building. "That's you," Sophia explained. "A superhero doctor. Because that's what you are." Grace's vision blurred with tears she couldn't stop. She'd spent 3 years believing she'd thrown her career away for nothing. That saving Sophia had been the right choice, but also the end of everything Grace had worked for. And here was Sophia herself, alive, brilliant, holding out a crayon drawing, proving that some endings are actually beginnings if you're brave enough to recognize them. "Thank you," Grace whispered, taking the drawing. "I'll keep this forever. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Rossi. Turn on the news. Blackstone arrested. SEC charges. Catherine's story broke an hour ago. Grace showed David, who quickly pulled up the Times website on his phone. Catherine Morrison's headline read, Hedge fund CEO who humiliated waitress arrested for fraud. Millions missing from client accounts. The article was devastating. Years of financial manipulation. Offshore accounts. Falsified returns. Dozens of clients who'd lost retirement savings while Blackstone spent lavishly on penthouses and $400 bottles of wine, and the appearance of success that was really just an elaborate con. Catherine interviewed 3 of his former employees, David read aloud. They all describe a pattern of verbal abuse and intimidation. One quit after Blackstone threw a phone at her head. Another developed an anxiety disorder from his constant criticism. She's painting a picture of someone who used cruelty as a management tool. Grace thought about that night in La Maison. How Blackstone had tried to strip away her dignity in front of 43 witnesses. How he'd assumed his wealth gave him the right to humiliate someone for being human. How he'd never expected that the waitress he was crushing might fight back with words that would expose exactly how hollow his power really was. It's all connected, Grace said slowly. The fraud, the cruelty, the need to dominate people. He was terrified that someone would see through him, so he attacked first, made everyone around him feel small, so nobody would look too closely at how empty he was. And then you refused to feel small, David said, and everything he'd built started falling apart. Grace's phone buzzed again. This time it was Jennifer Barrett. Medical board emergency session scheduled for next week. They want to review your case in light of new evidence. This is your chance, Grace. Don't waste it. Sophia was watching Grace with those 8-year-old eyes that saw more than adults gave her credit for. Are you going to be a doctor again? I don't know, Grace said honestly. I'm scared. What if I fight for my license back and they say no again? What if I put myself through all that pain for nothing? But what if they say yes? Sophia countered. Daddy says the bravest thing you can do is try even when you're scared. That's what you did when you saved me. You were probably scared then, too. Terrified, Grace admitted. I knew I'd lose my license. Knew I'd lose everything. But you needed help, and nobody else was helping, and I couldn't just walk away. So don't walk away now, Sophia said simply. Because other kids need doctors who won't walk away when it's hard. Doctors like you. Grace looked at David, who was crying openly now. At Sophia, who was smiling like she'd just solved a complicated puzzle. At the crayon drawing of a superhero doctor who looked nothing like Grace, but somehow captured exactly who she'd tried to be before the world told her she'd failed. Okay, Grace said. I'll fight. I'll petition the board. I'll tell them everything. And if they say no, at least I'll know I tried. Sophia handed Grace a purple crayon. You should add something to the picture. What should I add? Another superhero, Sophia said. Because superheroes work better in teams. And if you're going to fight, you need people fighting with you. Grace took the crayon and drew a smaller figure next to the flying doctor. That's you, she told Sophia, because you're the reason I'm going to keep fighting. As Grace left the cafe an hour later with Sophia's drawing carefully folded in her bag, she pulled out her phone and called Catherine Morrison. If she was going to fight the medical board and the hospital and the entire system that had punished her for saving a child's life, she needed someone who knew how to tell stories that made people pay attention. Catherine Morrison, the journalist answered. This is Grace Mitchell, Grace said. I want to tell you everything, about the surgery, about the administrator who took kickbacks, about the 18 children whose families were silenced with NDAs, about a system that cares more about liability than lives. When can we meet? Catherine asked immediately. Tomorrow, Grace said. Because if I'm going to be a superhero, I might as well give it everything I've got. She could almost hear Sophia's voice in her head. That's what you did when you saved me. You were probably scared then, too. Terrified, Grace thought. But I did it anyway. And tomorrow, she'd do it again. The medical board hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a conference room that felt too small for the decision being made inside it. Grace sat at a table facing 7 board members who would determine whether Dr. Grace Mitchell, pediatric surgeon, protocol violator, waitress, viral video subject, deserved a second chance. Jennifer Barrett sat at the end of the row, her expression carefully neutral. though Grace caught her glancing toward the door where Catherine Morrison sat with a notebook and the kind of focused attention that had already brought down a millionaire. "Dr. Mitchell," began Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to David, though the coincidence felt like fate. "We've reviewed your petition for license reinstatement in light of new evidence regarding the circumstances of your original revocation. Before we hear testimony, do you have an opening statement?" Grace stood, her hands steady in a way they hadn't been 3 years ago when this same board had stripped away everything she'd worked for. "3 years ago, I performed emergency surgery on a 5-year-old girl in a hospital corridor because hospital administrators refused to authorize treatment until her family could prove they could pay. I violated protocol. I operated without proper authorization. I used supplies that weren't cleared through proper channels." She paused, meeting each board member's eyes. "I'd do it again. Because Sophia Chen is alive. She's 8 years old. She's brilliant and healthy and drawing pictures of superhero doctors. And if following protocol means letting children die because their parents can't afford to save them, then the protocol is what's broken, not the doctors who refuse to follow it." The room was silent. Dr. Sarah Williams, a pediatric surgeon who'd been on the original board, leaned forward. "Dr. Mitchell, nobody disputes that you saved that child's life. The question has always been whether the ends justify the means. Whether allowing individual doctors to override hospital protocols designed to protect patients, creates more danger than it prevents." "With respect, Dr. Williams," Grace said, "the protocols didn't protect Sophia Chen. They almost killed her. And I've learned from Catherine Morrison's investigation that they did kill 3 other children whose families received settlement money and signed NDAs preventing them from speaking publicly about what happened." She pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. "These are the cases. Emma Rodriguez, 4 years old, died waiting for insurance approval for a procedure that would have saved her life. The family received $2 million and a legal agreement never to discuss how the hospital's billing department prioritized paperwork over their daughter's survival." Grace's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she laid out each page. "Marcus Thompson, 6 years old, died of complications that could have been prevented if treatment hadn't been delayed for financial verification. Family received $1.5 million and signed an NDA. Aisha Patel, 7 years old. Her case is particularly disturbing because she died 3 days after I saved Sophia Chen. Same hospital, same administrator refusing authorization. Different outcome because I wasn't there to violate protocol and save her life." Dr. Williams had tears in her eyes. 2 other board members looked ill. Jennifer Barrett sat perfectly still, watching Grace reveal truths that the medical establishment had worked hard to bury. "The administrator who made these decisions," Grace continued, "was fired 6 months after my hearing. Not for letting children die. Not for prioritizing hospital revenue over patient care. But because someone discovered he was taking kickbacks from insurance companies to delay expensive procedures. He made money every time a child had to wait, every time a family was told they couldn't afford to save their son or daughter." She turned to Jennifer Barrett. "Dr. Barrett knew about this. Couldn't prove it because of the NDAs. Couldn't speak publicly because the evidence was sealed. But she knew that I lost my license to cover up a much bigger crime. That I was sacrificed to protect a system that was actively killing children for profit." Jennifer met Grace's eyes and nodded once, acknowledging the truth that had haunted her for 3 years. "So yes," Grace said, "I violated protocol. I operated without authorization. I risked my career and my freedom to save a child's life. And the medical board punished me for it while the administrator who caused the problem kept working until his financial crimes became too obvious to ignore." She placed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. "I'm not asking you to condone what I did. I'm asking you to consider what it means when we punish doctors for having the courage to save lives, while administrators who prioritize profit over patients face no consequences until their corruption threatens the hospital's bottom line." Dr. Williams spoke first. "Dr. Mitchell, if we reinstate your license, what assurance do we have that you won't continue to violate protocols whenever you disagree with hospital policy?" "None," Grace said honestly. "Because if I'm ever in a situation where a child will die unless I act immediately, I'll act. I'll deal with the consequences afterward. But I won't let another Aisha Patel die while I wait for authorization that might never come." That's exactly the problem, Dr. Robert Chen said. We can't have doctors making individual decisions about when rules apply and when they don't. That's chaos. Is it? Catherine Morrison's voice came from the back of the room. She stood, and Grace noticed several board members stiffen. They knew who she was, knew what her journalism had already accomplished. Or is chaos what happens when we create systems that force doctors to choose between their licenses and their patients' lives? Ms. Morrison, Dr. Chen began, this is a closed hearing. It was a closed hearing, Catherine interrupted, holding up her phone. Until I started live streaming it 5 minutes ago. 40,000 people are watching right now. They've heard Dr. Mitchell describe how 3 children died because hospital administrators valued money over medicine. They've heard her explain how the doctor who saved Sophia Chen was punished while the administrator who let Aisha Patel die was only fired after his financial crimes became public. She walked toward the front of the room. I've spent the past week investigating Mount Sinai Hospital. The administrator in question, Martin Reeves, delayed treatment for at least 18 children over 2 years. The hospital paid out over $30 million in settlements, $30 million to silence grieving parents, while Dr. Mitchell lost her license for being the only person in that building willing to save a child without checking her bank account first. Catherine placed her own folder on the table. I have interviews with 5 families who signed NDAs. They're willing to break those agreements now because they've seen Dr. Mitchell's video. They've watched her tell a millionaire that human dignity matters more than wealth. And they've realized that their children's lives mattered more than the legal agreements they signed while drowning in grief. She turned to face the board directly. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to reinstate Dr. Mitchell's license. You're going to issue a public apology for punishing her while protecting a corrupt system. And you're going to recommend that Mount Sinai Hospital faces investigation for covering up Martin Reeves's crimes for 2 years, while good doctors were afraid to violate protocols that were literally killing children. You can't dictate, Dr. Chen started. I'm not dictating, Catherine said. I'm reporting. And right now, 45,000 people are watching this hearing and waiting to see if the medical establishment will finally do the right thing, or if you'll continue protecting yourselves instead of patients. The room erupted. Board members arguing. Jennifer Barrett standing, calling for order. Grace, sitting silently at her table, watching the system that had destroyed her beginning to crack under the weight of truths it could no longer hide. Finally, Jennifer's voice cut through the chaos. Enough. She turned to face her fellow board members. Catherine Morrison is right. We owe Dr. Mitchell an apology. We owe Sophia Chen's family an apology. We owe the families of Emma Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson and Aisha Patel an apology. She looked at Grace. 3 years ago, I sat in this chair and told you that protocols existed to protect patients. I was wrong. The protocols protected the hospital, protected administrators who made money from suffering, protected a system that valued liability over lives. Jennifer's voice broke slightly. You violated protocols to save a child, and we punished you for it because it was easier to sacrifice one doctor than to confront how broken our system had become. I'm sorry, Grace. I'm so deeply sorry. The other board members sat in stunned silence. Catherine's phone continued live streaming. Somewhere in the digital audience, David Chen was probably watching with Sophia beside him. Thomas Rossi was probably watching from La Maison. Maria Santos and every service worker who'd ever been treated as invisible was probably watching a moment of vindication they'd waited their whole lives to see. All in favor of reinstating Dr. Grace Mitchell's medical license, Jennifer said. Raise your hand. 7 hands rose. Unanimous, unambiguous. A second chance that felt less like forgiveness, and more like the system finally acknowledging it had punished the wrong person. Grace stood there, unable to speak, unable to process that 3 years of hiding and grief and pouring wine for people who didn't see her had just ended in a conference room with 50,000 people watching online. There's one more thing, Jennifer said. She pulled out a letter, handed it to Grace. This is from the board of directors at Mount Sinai Hospital. They're offering you a position as head of pediatric emergency medicine, with full authority to override financial protocols when patient lives are at risk. They're calling it the Sophia Chen Protocol. Treatment first, billing second, no exceptions. Grace read the letter twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. Not just her license back, not just vindication, but a position that would let her prevent what happened to Aisha Patel from ever happening again. They're also establishing a fund, Jennifer continued, to cover emergency procedures for families who can't afford upfront payment. It's being named the Grace Mitchell Emergency Treatment Fund. Initial funding of $5 million, with donations already coming in from people who watched your video and wanted to help. Catherine was still live streaming, still capturing this moment when a waitress who'd told a millionaire that money couldn't fix what was broken inside him became the doctor who'd fix what was broken inside the medical system. "Do you accept?" Jennifer asked. Grace looked at the letter, at the board members who'd just voted unanimously to restore what they'd taken, at Catherine, whose journalism had exposed truths that powerful people worked hard to hide, at the camera capturing this moment for an audience that had grown to 70,000 people watching a story about courage and redemption, and the fact that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything but creates something even more valuable. "I accept," Grace said, "and I promise I'll keep violating protocols every single time a child's life depends on it." The live stream exploded with comments. The board members smiled, some with relief, some with genuine joy. Jennifer Barrett wiped her eyes and looked like she'd finally found the redemption she'd been seeking for 3 years. And Grace Mitchell, Dr. Grace Mitchell again, held the letter that proved that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding something better. Grace's first day back at Mount Sinai Hospital began with Sophia Chen waiting in her new office. The 8-year-old sat in the chair that used to belong to the administrator who'd refused to save her life, holding a bouquet of flowers she'd picked herself and wearing a shirt that read, "My doctor is a superhero." David stood behind her, tears already forming before Grace had even walked through the door. "We wanted to be your first visitors," Sophia said, handing Grace the flowers. "Daddy says it's important to remember where you started so you never forget why you're here." Grace knelt down to Sophia's level, taking the flowers with hands that had steadied over the past few weeks. "I could never forget. You're the reason I'm here, the reason any of this matters." "I brought you something else," Sophia said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "It's the new drawing. I added more superheroes." Grace unfolded it carefully. The crayon picture now showed multiple figures in capes, one labeled Dr. Grace, another Daddy, a third Ms. Catherine, and a fourth simply marked, "Anyone who helps when it's scary." "That last one is for everyone," Sophia explained. "Because you taught me that superheroes aren't just people with powers. They're people who do the right thing even when it's hard. And anybody can be that kind of superhero if they're brave enough." David wiped his eyes. "She's been practicing that explanation for a week. Wanted it to be perfect for today." "It is perfect," Grace said, taping the drawing to her office wall where she'd see it every day. A reminder that saving one life had somehow created ripples that changed dozens more. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Rossi. "La Maison is throwing you a celebration dinner tonight. The staff insists. Maria's already crying and you haven't even arrived yet." Grace smiled, thinking about the restaurant that had given her refuge when she'd had nowhere else to go. About Maria Santos, who'd shown her how to fold napkins and balance trays and remember that dignity wasn't determined by job titles. About Thomas, who'd given her a raise and banned a millionaire rather than sacrifice someone who'd been treated badly. "I need to get to work," Grace told Sophia and David, "but I'll see you both soon. And Sophia, thank you for reminding me what superheroes really look like." As they left, Grace turned to face her office window overlooking the pediatric emergency department. The same corridors where she'd performed that desperate surgery 3 years ago. The same hospital that had punished her for caring more about a child's life than institutional protocols. Except now everything was different. The Sophia Chen protocol meant no child would be denied emergency treatment for financial reasons. The Grace Mitchell Emergency Treatment Fund had grown to $8 million in donations from people who'd watched her video and wanted to ensure no parent ever had to choose between their savings and their child's survival. And Martin Reeves, the administrator who'd taken kickbacks and let children die, was facing federal charges for fraud and negligent homicide. His trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months, and Catherine Morrison would be covering every moment. Grace's first case arrived within an hour. A 7-year-old boy with acute appendicitis, whose parents were undocumented immigrants, terrified that seeking medical help would lead to deportation. They'd waited until their son was barely conscious, his fever spiking dangerously, before bringing him to the emergency room. "We don't have papers," the mother said, her English halting and fearful. "We don't have insurance, but please, our son—" "Your son needs immediate surgery," Grace said, already calling for an operating room. "And you don't need papers or insurance or anything except to hold your son's hand and tell him he's going to be okay." The father stared at her. "But the cost is covered by the Grace Mitchell Emergency Treatment Fund," Grace said, "which exists specifically so that families like yours never have to watch their children suffer because they're afraid they can't afford to save them." She knelt down to the boy's level, meeting his frightened eyes. "Hi, I'm Dr. Mitchell. I'm going to fix your stomach so it doesn't hurt anymore. You're going to be just fine." 3 hours later, the surgery was complete. The boy would recover fully. His parents sat in the waiting room crying with relief, holding the paperwork that explained their son's treatment was fully covered, and no one would ask about their immigration status. Grace thought about Sophia Chen, about how one choice to violate protocol 3 years ago had created a system where other families wouldn't face the same impossible situation, about how losing everything had somehow led to building something better. That evening, La Maison was packed with people who'd come to celebrate. Thomas had closed the restaurant to regular customers, filling it instead with hospital staff, former colleagues who'd supported Grace during her suspension, families whose children had been treated under the new protocol, and service workers from across Manhattan who'd seen the viral video and understood exactly what it meant when someone refused to let wealth determine worth. Maria Santos hugged Grace so hard she could barely breathe. "You came back. I knew you would. Knew you were too stubborn to stay hidden forever." "I learned from the best," Grace said, gesturing at Maria, whose 20 years at La Maison had been built on treating every customer with dignity, regardless of how they treated her. Catherine Morrison was there with her photographer, documenting the celebration for a follow-up piece about Grace's return to medicine. But she'd put her notebook down for now, simply enjoying the moment when journalism helped change something instead of just reporting on how broken it was. "Richard Blackstone's trial starts next month," Catherine said, joining Grace at the bar. "SEC is bringing 47 counts of fraud. He'll spend the next decade in prison if convicted, which he will be, because the evidence is overwhelming." "What about his victims?" Grace asked. "The clients who lost their savings?" "There's a recovery fund being established. Won't make them whole, but it's something." Catherine paused. "He released a statement yesterday, through his lawyer. Said he's deeply sorry for his actions and takes full responsibility." "Does he?" Grace asked. "No," Catherine said. "He takes responsibility for getting caught. There's a difference, but at least he can't hurt anyone else now. And the video of him screaming at you. It's being used in business schools as an example of toxic leadership. You humiliated him so thoroughly that his name is now synonymous with entitled cruelty." Grace thought about that night, about the wine stain and the 43 witnesses, and the moment she'd decided that silence hurt more than speaking, about how one choice to defend her dignity had exposed corruption in both a hedge fund and a hospital system. "I didn't mean to destroy him," Grace said. "I just meant to remind him that wealth doesn't make you better than other people." "You did both," Catherine said, "and the world is better for it." Jennifer Barrett arrived late, looking nervous and out of place among the celebration. She approached Grace hesitantly. "I wasn't sure if I should come, given everything." "You helped get my license back," Grace said. "You exposed the truth about Martin Reeves." "You apologize publicly. That takes courage." "It takes basic decency," Jennifer corrected, "which I should have had 3 years ago. I've been thinking about resigning from the medical board. Let someone with more integrity take over." "Don't," Grace said. "Stay. Because the board needs people who've learned that protecting patients matters more than protecting institutions. You made a mistake. You fixed it." "That makes you exactly the kind of person who should be making decisions about other doctors' futures." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the evening progressed, Grace found herself standing with David and Sophia Chen, watching the celebration unfold around them. Thomas gave a toast about courage and dignity. Maria shared stories about Grace's 8 months as a waitress. Catherine announced her next investigation would focus on hospital billing practices that prioritized profit over care. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked Grace quietly. "That surgery 3 years ago? Everything it cost you?" Grace looked at Sophia, who was showing her superhero drawing to anyone who'd look at it. At the room full of people celebrating not just her return to medicine, but the systemic changes that return had created, at the families whose children would never face what the Chens had faced because one doctor had been willing to lose everything to save one life. "No," Grace said. "I don't regret it at all." Sophia tugged on Grace's sleeve. "Doctor." "Grace, can I tell everyone about the boy you saved today?" "How did you know about that?" Grace asked. "Daddy called the hospital to check on you. They told him about the surgery, about the family who was scared because they didn't have papers." Sophia's face was serious. "You saved another kid, just like you saved me. That's what superheroes do." Grace knelt down, meeting Sophia's eyes. "You know what I learned. Being a superhero isn't about being perfect or following every rule. It's about showing up when people need help. It's about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. It's about remembering that every person you meet, whether they're wearing a designer suit or a waitress uniform, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." "Is that what you told the mean man?" Sophia asked. "At the restaurant?" "That's exactly what I told him," Grace said. "And you know what? It turns out that message mattered more than I realized, because now millions of people have heard it, and maybe some of them will remember that wealth doesn't determine worth, that power doesn't give you the right to be cruel, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for yourself and remind the world that every human life has value." Sophia hugged her tightly. "I'm glad you're my doctor, and my superhero, and my friend." As Grace stood up, looking around La Maison at the community that had formed around one moment of courage, she realized that 3 years ago she'd thought losing her medical license meant losing everything that mattered. She'd been wrong. She'd lost a title and gained something far more valuable. The understanding that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about dignity. About refusing to let systems crush the people they were supposed to protect. About speaking truth to power, even when that power seemed unbeatable. Richard Blackstone had tried to humiliate a waitress and ended up exposing his own emptiness. Martin Reeves had tried to profit from suffering and ended up facing justice. A medical board had tried to sacrifice one doctor to protect a broken system and ended up reforming that system instead. And Grace Mitchell, who'd once believed that saving one child in a hospital corridor was the end of her story, had discovered it was actually the beginning. The room raised their glasses. Thomas proposed a final toast. "To Dr. Grace Mitchell, who taught us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified, and who proved that sometimes losing everything is just the first step toward changing it all." Grace raised her glass, thinking about Sophia's drawing on her office wall, about the boy she'd saved that morning, about all the children who would be treated tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, because one doctor had refused to let protocols matter more than lives. "To second chances," Grace said, "and to everyone brave enough to take them." The celebration continued late into the night, but Grace knew she'd carry this moment forever. Not because she'd gotten her license back or her career restored, but because she'd learned that true healing came from refusing to let cruelty win. And in a world that sometimes felt designed to crush the vulnerable, that was the most powerful medicine of all.